Frid och shalom vänner, och idag är det alltså den 25 december. Juldagsmorgon glimmar sjunger vi ju. Många kanske har varit på julotta till och med idag. Inte vet jag, men vi börjar med en video på ungefär 30 minuter som är ett måste för er som vill förstå vad som händer. Och den kan vi döpa till då Hitler, islam och antisemitism. Och det är Kate Malcolmson som predikar. Det här är väldigt viktigt att vi förstår. Sen kommer nyhetsflash med lite saker sen. Gud välsigna er, så hörs vi sen under dagen. Amen.
He was dominated by anti-Semitism. We must never forget this. This was his lifeblood. One of the most dominating ideas, teachings, messages, reasons for everything he done was his hatred of the Jew. Not Britain, not the English, not the French. He fought them, killed them, but it was the Jew he hated. He had a determination to exterminate the Jew and desired to do that more than win the war. You know, when it got near the end of the war and it looked like he could begin losing, he took all of his resources and moved them to annihilate more Jews. He had to kill the Jews. He was even willing to lose the war in order to kill Jews. There's something terribly wrong with this. And so from 1920, Hitler and the Nazi Party rose up. Constantly, they spewed out hatred and anger against the Jew. He hated the Jew. He introduced the medical system, eugenics, science, to think up ways to kill the Jews. You know, in the 1930s, he took over the whole medical system of Germany, the doctors, the nurses, and he employed them on experimenting on Jews, their children, their wives, men, women, children. In fact, Hitler could not have done what he'd done without the medical system in Germany. He brought it on board as a tool of Nazism against the Jew. You see, all of this comes out of the heart. We must never forget how wicked a man's heart can be. I know most aren't like that. Anger is dangerous. Hatred is dangerous. Attitudes of the heart are dangerous. And so Hitler was dominated by this. That's not natural. The 20th century was marked by this, a hatred of the Jew. Don't tell me that's normal. Just like with Haman, I believe the devil's behind this. There's no way Hitler could have conceived this with natural logical thinking. What Jew ever done anything to him? Do you know all the experts on Hitler? They write book after book trying to discover why did he hate the Jew? And they say it was for this reason, and this reason, and this reason. I won't list them all to you. I believe they've all missed it. It is a power far greater behind that of evil that hates the Jew. Because the Bible speaks about the Jew. I believe that is what was there. And so we heard last week about 1938, it was the anniversary last Thursday, of Kristallnacht. That's when Jews were attacked, their shop windows broken, 1,000 synagogues burnt down, glass broke across the nation as they attacked the Jew. But you know, before that, they took away their citizenship. They threw their children out of the schools. Step by step from 1932-3, Hitler gained power and constantly brought in laws, legislation against the Jew. There's something behind this of such evil you can't imagine. And you know what? It's going to get worse in the days ahead. Our Bible predicts something that makes Hitler look like a picnic. And I don't minimize anything. Our Bible is very clear what's going to happen in the days ahead. You may say, why call it Hitler, Islam, and anti-Semitism? You may say, what does Hitler, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews dying, Nazism that was defeated in 1945, what does that have to do with Islam and with Gaza and with what's happening today? Everything. You can't even understand what's happening on your news today unless you understand what I'm just about to say. I'm going to tell you something remarkable. Haman, Hitler, and the third man, and this is what I want you to hear tonight. You don't hear anything else, hear this. No, let me rephrase that. If you're going to hear anything, hear the bit I said about needing Christ and the love of Christ. But on a secular front, hear this. I'm going to tell you here for a moment, because you cannot, and you're going to see when I connect these dots, why our whole world, why is it claimed that 1 million people marched in London last weekend? Pro-Palestinian, or should I say pro-Hamas? Why is it all across America, in universities and colleges, young people, teenagers are rising up, chanting Hamas chants? Why is there a rise of anti-Semitism right now, in the past several weeks, greater than I've seen in my entire lifetime, and hasn't been seen maybe since 1945, or so we think? This man's going to explain everything. Because see, al-Husseini, that I'm going to tell you about, he was involved in the First World War and massacres of Jews, the Second World War Holocaust, and then he continued moving into Soviet communism to promote attacks on Israel. This man's unique. In fact, you can't understand Hamas unless you understand this man. You can't understand the PLO, the West Bank, or anti-Semitism in this hour without coming across him. Let me give you the facts about him in case you should doubt this. If you think Haman was evil and Hitler was evil, this man takes step by step with them in more ways than you can imagine. Al-Husseini was a Muslim from Jerusalem in what was called Palestine, but all Jews were called Palestinians back then, at the time he was born. He was born into one of the ruling families in Jerusalem under the Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire. They ruled over the entire Middle East, over Jerusalem, and his family was one of the key families. Many of them were called muftis, grand muftis, in other words, Muslim leaders within Jerusalem and within the area. So he come out of this family. They as a family claimed to descend directly from Muhammad, the prophet who initiated Islam. And he made early contacts with anti-Semitism. He went to a Catholic school in the city of Jerusalem to learn the French language. He was a very intelligent young boy. While he was in that French school, he come in contact in that Catholic school with priests and with teachers who began to share with him theories about Jews, the protocols of Zion, and about conspiracies about the Jews. It was a Catholic that shared with this young boy as he learnt the French language. And so these views started to come to him very young and from his own home. When the First World War broke out, he joined the Turkish army to fight for Turkey against the Allied forces and got injured during that time. Then at the end of the First World War, he moved his allegiance to the British in order to be on the winning side. In 1920, he started the first of his Arab riots. He would do another one in 1929 and 36, and this would become a dominant thing with him, hatred of the Jew. This is one of the most important Muslims you're ever going to hear about in your entire life, outside of Muhammad himself. A very important. In May 1921, the British made him the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. They thought he was a moderate. They thought they could trust him. They thought he was pro-British, that he would benefit their cause against other powers in the region. So they raised him to power. Then he became the chairman of the Palestinian Muslim Council. He went from power to power, politically, religiously, in his influence. He traveled the Middle East. He knew everybody that was anybody to know. And he'd become known as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. It was very prestigious, but the British had actually given him this position. The British promised the Arabs that they would have a state. In the Balfour Declaration, the Jews also were promised a state, and they tried to organize this, say there would be a large Palestinian state, Muslim state, and within that would be a Jewish free state. It was a two-state declaration. But you know, Husseini did not want any room for the Jew. It wasn't live and let live. He, at an early stage, hated the Jew. He wanted annihilation of the Jew. He didn't want to live at peace with the Jew. He was like Hitler, and he didn't know Hitler at this stage. He was an anti-Semite with a real anger and bitterness against the Jew. In 1928, he created the Supreme Muslim Council and began to spread rumors in the Arab world about a Zionist plot to destroy the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, including the mosque, the Dome of the Rock there. He was the biggest promoter prior to the Second World War. He spread constantly, the Jew is going to destroy everything Muslim, take over Jerusalem, and then take over every Arab Muslim country in the Middle East. He was a conspiracy theorist. He picked up fables about the protocols of Zion. He believed them, and it drove him crazy and angry against the Jew. Again, it wasn't logical how he lived and thought. Other Arabs around him weren't thinking like this. They weren't reading these things. They weren't looking for the annihilation of the Jew. Most Muslims and most Arabs in the Middle East prior to the Second World War were quite happy to live at peace. They were in fact very pro-British at the time. But there was a man in the midst beginning to rise to power who had a hatred. In 1931, he attended the World Islamic Council. He called it together in Jerusalem. And at that council, he boycotted trade with every single Jew in Palestine and the Middle East. In 1933, and this is where I'm going to connect the dots here. Listen very carefully. I want you to understand that if you didn't have a Hitler and Nazism, you would not have the modern problem in the Middle East. You wouldn't have a Hamas if there wasn't Nazism. Let me prove it here. In 1933, German Nazi leaders sent from Hitler went to Jerusalem in the Middle East to meet with al-Husseini. They began to talk through the plan of Muslims and Nazis working together in the Middle East against the British and against the Jew. In 1933, Hitler suggested to him that they should not have a jihad against the Jews in the Middle East yet, because he's going to do it in Europe. After he annihilates the Jew in Europe, then you can annihilate all the Jews in Jerusalem and throughout the Middle East, and we'll help you. You help us now, we'll help you then. There began to be a plan forged from 1933 between Muslims in the Middle East and Nazism in Berlin to begin working together. They would help us in Germany. We will help them in their Muslim nations. And you know what the target is? The Jew. We're going to work together across our nations against the Jew. This is history. And you know what I'm just telling you now is history that most do not know. But you can't understand today's world unless you have this. This al-Husseini is a radical Muslim. And when you see it in today's world, he is the father of it. Muslims were mostly moderate in that day, but here come a radical Muslim with vengeance and hatred. The British actually put out a call or a warrant for his arrest. And so in 1937, before the war, he fled Jerusalem because Britain was in power there. And he fled to Iraq in 1939. Guess what he done there? He joined Muslim soldiers, created a coup to rise up and to take the nation of Iraq. It was to be a pro-Nazi Iraq. And he was working with Nazism to create this coup, to make it radical anti-British and anti-Jew. But it was defeated. The attempt failed, and he had to flee Iraq. Guess where he went to? He went to Berlin at that point, after this failed coup. He met up with Hitler for the very first time in a remarkable meeting. In 1941, he had a 90-minute meeting with Hitler, and they solidified their plans together. How this Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, this Muslim, al-Husseini, it was going to stay in Berlin and promote the annihilation of the Jew. He was going to be the #1 worker alongside Hitler, outside of his top command, his most wicked generals. This man is the most important man in the Holocaust. You never hear his name. He was one of the most radical of Muslims in that hour. And so as they sat and they talked, they made a genocidal pact to annihilate the Jew. One in the Middle East, he would finish that task. And one in Europe, he intended to finish his task. He spent 4 years in Germany and Italy, 3 years in Germany, 1 year in Italy, 1 year working for Mussolini, and 3 years working for Hitler, but all in the same task, the annihilation of the Jew. But listen, just before this, he published a booklet in 1937, before he come to Berlin. It was called Islam and Judaism. And it was the founding document of modern Islamic anti-Semitism. You see, Hitler said they're a race. It's DNA. You can't convert to be anything else. If you're a Jew, you're always a Jew. You're impure. It's not to do with religion. It's scientific. It's evolutionary. It's Darwinism. Darwin really affected Hitler in all of his ideology. But you know the difference with al-Husseini? He was going to make anti-Semitism purely Jewish. And he wanted to spread in the Middle East that if you're a Muslim, you are against the Jew. You hate the Jew. To be a Muslim is to be a Jew hater. He didn't want that separated. He wanted to join it, and he was very successful at it. This is the one man that created the anger and the bitterness in the Muslim world of the Middle East in this hour. And so this book he put out, he used religious reasons, the sole reason for opposition to the Jew. He actually went back to the 7th century, to Muhammad, and Muhammad's war against the Jews in the 7th century, and he brought it right back into the 20th century. There was no war from Muslims against the Jews. Oh yes, there was always some trouble, but there was peace. Jews were living peacefully generally in the Middle East, all in Muslim countries. After the influence of this, they would get driven out of every single Muslim Arab nation as a result of this. It was major. They had lived in Arab Muslim nations for 3,000 years. But within one generation, some countries you wouldn't find one Jew in, all because of this man, all because of this book. And so he tied Muhammad's fight against the Jew to a 20th century fight that must arise and attack the Jew. Remember, this is written 11 years before there's a state of Israel. Don't let anyone tell you that Muslim anti-Semitism is actually there because of Israel being a state and attacking the Palestinians and stealing their land. Oh no, it's not. It's the other way round. You've got problems because of a man like this who was working with Hitler and with Nazism. It's utterly remarkable. Let me tell you about the propaganda, because this is the most important point I'm going to say of this. Since 1939, or beginning in 1939, a shortwave radio was set up outside of Berlin. It was the most powerful radio that had ever been built in the world. The greatest, the best technology, the clearest recording, broadcast. Do you know where it was focused? The Arab world. The entire Middle East and North Africa, this radio was aimed at that whole region. They actually hired professionals, experts from the Middle East to preach in the Arabic tongue, who are going to use this radio aimed at Muslims all across the Middle East. Whose plan was this? This was Hitler's. And you know what? He brought Husseini in on this to be one of the key persons to use this. As this propaganda plan against the Middle East began, there were about 90,000 radios in the Middle East. You know, I've read accounts in some of these countries and towns. People said, a radio? What's that? You know what I'm like with technology. You mentioned the lace. I'll go, what's that? They didn't know what a radio was. Never heard about it. Do you know what Mussolini did? He brought radios in free all across the Middle East. 90,000 radios were there. They had set them up in cafes or in marketplaces that the audience was very large. They would start their programs by reading from the Quran. Then after reading entire chapters of the Quran, they immediately infused it with conspiracy theories that we dealt with last week against the Jews. The Jews are taking over the world. The Jews are pigs. The Jews must be annihilated. They had this radio station outside of Berlin manned by German scholars, experts, who had strong arguments. All of this influence and all the money of Hitler was behind it. This was very important. It actually grew to the point of having 1 million listeners at least every week. Husseini also broadcast from Rome and Italy for Mussolini, the very same things. And Goebbels, who is Hitler's propaganda expert, worked over this Muslim, trained the Muslim men. How do you speak? How do you breathe out hatred? Like he was out across Europe against the Jew, against the British, against the French, against the Dutch. Here were men only set against the Jew. Think about it. This was all across the Middle East, beginning in 1939. You want to know why we've got a problem now? Rising up out of Arabic cultures. At this stage, there was an 80% illiteracy condition right across the Arabic world of the Middle East. So listening, hearing things was very important. They were mostly casual before the war, but all through the war, for the next 6 years, this radio pumps into every country, Muslim, Arab, in the Middle East, every single day, 3 times a day, every nation, every major town and city, every single day for 6 years, with Arabic speakers preaching against the Jew. You want to know why there's a problem in the Middle East? It's part of Nazi Hitlerism. It was him creating it, guarding it. Oh, something was unleashed that you can't even imagine. This Al-Husseini lived on in Germany for 3 years. They paid his salary for those 3 years. And in fact, they say that he was paid more than a German field marshal. And a German field marshal is as high as you get militarily. He was paid more than them. Do you know what he done when he was in Berlin? I've looked at the photographs. He went round all the Holocaust concentration camps. Hess, all the massacres of Hitler, all the murders of the concentration camps. He went in there, escorted. He would go around looking. He would inspect the German soldiers and rebuke them, saying, you're not doing a good enough job killing the Jews. You've got to do better. This was a vile, evil man. He was bloodthirsty. He enjoyed the concentration camp. He also was the key man who moved out into Bosnia and Serbia, and he raised up tens of thousands of Muslims to serve Nazism in the SS. This just keeps growing when you begin to investigate it. In December 1942, They created Berlin's Islamic Central Institute, or propaganda hub. And at his inaugural speech, he says, Nazism and Islam have a common enemy. It's the Jew. Do you know in Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote, My Struggle, his classic book of hatred against the Jew, all his views were there in the 20s. No one believed him. You better not underestimate anger, jealousy, bitterness, murder, hatred. It's wicked. Don't call it anything else. It's wrong. You don't have the right to hate Muslim or homosexual or anyone else. I don't compromise with sin, but I don't hate anyone. I love sinners. Jesus died for sinners. I believe they can be born again, saved by God's grace. In 1944, near the end of the war, the Allies issued a warrant for al-Husseini's arrest again. But he escaped in 1945 before Nuremberg. Remember the Nuremberg trials? There in Germany, all the worst Holocaust generals had to stand trial unless they'd committed suicide or fled to Argentina or went through the rat lines. You know what the rat lines are? Set up by the Catholic Church, by Catholic priests through monasteries. Who helped all the top generals escape more than any other institution? The Catholic Church. Cardinals. It's notorious what they done. I wonder why. Why would they do that for men like that? In 1945, al-Husseini escaped and went to Egypt. He escaped all these trials. The Allied forces wanted him and then said, what are we going to do with him if we pick him up? So he escaped. Do you know what's going to happen 3 years later at the end of the war? Israel's going to be birthed as a nation in one day. And the first war takes place of all these Muslim nations. Listen to me. I know I'm saying this, but I want you to listen. I want you to understand something. Why do you think when Israel was birthed, they escaped the Holocaust? They escaped from Europe. They had no homeland. They weren't an army. They weren't attacking anyone. They're refugees. They are those that have survived Hitler's Nazism. They're rescued out of death camps. And they arrived in dribs and drabs. Why do you think on the first day after being created as a nation, all these Muslim radicals attacked Israel? Why do you think that is? 3 years after the end of the war, there is a connection. 6 years of propaganda, anti-Judaism, hatred, anger, pure Nazi propaganda pumped out every single day into these nations. Why do you think they rose up in one day against the new state of Israel on its first day and says, we'll annihilate you? What was it, an army of 40 million? There's hardly a population of 1 million there of Jews. Why would they do that? But you know this al-Husseini, he escaped. But he's still there. Do you know who he trained after the war? Let me give you some facts just so you know. Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, who was the accomplice of Hitler, they say the most next wicked man to Hitler. Do you know what he said? He escaped, got to Argentina. Remember years later, the Jews picked him up, flew him back to Israel, kidnapped him. They thought he was gone. Listen to what Eichmann said at the end of the Second World War, because Nazism had failed. Listen to what he says carefully. I have not managed to complete the annihilation of the Jew, but I hope the Muslims will. That's his statement at the end of the Second World War. Al-Husseini stirred up an Arab revolt in the Middle East to fight the Jews. Do you know what Hitler started doing in the Middle East with the help of al-Husseini during the war, at the end of the war, before Israel became a state? They took Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, translated into the Arabic, and began publishing it all across the Middle East. You know, the other day on a news item, it came up, a Jewish soldier, while searching a dead Hamas terrorist, discovered in his pocket Hitler's Mein Kampf. That was just the other day. It was all marked up, notes written from Hitler's Mein Kampf, his hatred of Jews. That's still happening. Don't tell me this isn't connected. It's absolutely connected. Or what about the book I told you about that came out of Russia, The Persecution of Jews, the Elders of Zion, of the Protocols of Zion? They also began translating that into the Arabic language, Hitler and al-Husseini, and put it out all across the Middle East. Do you know present-day Islam generally believes the Protocols of Zion? It's put on in the newspapers, it's put on their televisions. The book is popularly sold across the country. Mein Kampf. Nazism they're proud of it in the Muslim world. They count Hitler a hero in today's Muslim world. Back in the Second World War, al-Husseini used Nazi funding to partially fund and create the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that would give rise to Hamas, give rise to all these different Muslim terrorist groups. Anti-Semitism was never discredited in 1948 in the Middle East. Never in the Muslim world. It was in Europe. I grew up knowing Hitler's a vile man. Nazism, something evil got a hold of it. But that never took place in the Middle East. They never come to understand that at all. Here's another one. After the end of the Second World War, who do you think al-Husseini personally mentored in the 50s and 60s in Egypt? Trained him up, become his personal discipleship. A man called Ararat, who became the leader of the PLO, who lived in the West Bank and opposed Israel dogmatically, calling for their utter destruction. See, the story never changes. See what happened to Hamas? You want to know why God has war with the Amalekites and Agag? There's a reason. Something is coming through that family. Nazism is connected to Hamas. You can't understand Hamas without understanding Nazism. You can't understand today's Muslim world unless you understand Germany of the Second World War. After 1945, it was mostly in Arab countries that Nazism was tolerated and commended. Many Nazi war criminals escaped. I think it was 4,000 went to Egypt, settled down, new name, new job. Medical doctors, all of the rest. They settled down there. They were protected. And then they entered into a Muslim war. You know, when Arafat took over the PLO, al-Husseini sent him ex-Nazi soldiers to train the PLO. That's who helped him. I could go on and on and on here. I'm only touching on this. I've only begun on this, really. But I'm going to close now. But I want you to understand what's happened in the Middle East. See, 1948, the Muslim war against the initial state of Israel was an aftershock. Do you know what an aftershock is? An earthquake hits devastatingly. Then there's a little delay, just a little delay, but it's the same earthquake. An aftershock, it's the same earthquake, but it's the aftershock hitting. That was 1948. The Arab-Israeli wars are still part of the Second World War. They were reached by propaganda. The devil was behind it. It was instigated. So today you have 1.7 billion Muslims across the world, opposed to 14 million Jews who only have one bit of land to settle in all of the world. And now anti-Semitism is bigger in the Western world than in all of history. 1 million people marching in London against the Jew. Why isn't anyone speaking about this or looking at this? Let me just finish here with 4 key points that I want you to hear, which are very important. Very, very important as we close this. Do you know what I believe? I believe in a God of love. Do you hear me? We are in a world in chaos. My Bible gives prophecies of what's just about to happen in the years ahead with the Jewish rebirthed nation. It predicted it. 2,700 years ago, God said Israel would be scattered across all the nations, and then it would be regathered to its same land, same mountains, same villages, same valleys, same everything. And it would be miraculous, and it would happen in one day. They were scattered beginning in AD 70, and they didn't get recreated again until 1948, almost 2,000 years. Do you know what I believe? I believe in a God of love. God so loved you that he gave his only son. See, in Islam, there's no love, no forgiveness, no mercy, no hope of eternal salvation. You know what a Muslim does? He'll carry out martyrdoms or suicide bombings, hoping that he'll be accepted by Allah. But no one in Islam knows. I'm going to tell you, my Bible says God is a God of love. He loves you. He died for you when you didn't deserve